Morning, Maggie.
Good morning. So I'm just going to do a quick review before the session begins, and then I'll hand it over to you, but it should only take about 5 minutes.
Perfect. I've gone through and edited the slideshow. Are you happy for me just to share my screen and then I'll just work my way? Is that
Yeah,
right?
I made you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Excellent. Okay. Maggie, I've just worked out why your screen is so long. It's because of your monitor, isn't it? That it's flipped vertically.
Oh, is it showing that one?
It
Yikes.
is, yeah. I was sitting there being like, is this so I like this is a piece I've never seen before. So I was like,
Is
okay.
that better? Did that?
There we go. Yeah,
Okay.
way better.
All right, everybody, it is now 11 a.m., so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a quick review of the last session and give you guys some things to think about as we go into this next presentation real quick before I hand things over to Pete. So yesterday we learned that there are creative ways to assess community needs through research and participatory activities such as interviews and surveys. We also learned that assessment allows for activities that are aligned with community needs and incorporate community assets. In today's session, we're going to learn what a stakeholder is and how to assess their community needs. One thing to think about as we go into this is how can you tailor your community assessment strategies based on your own stakeholder composition within your communities. And then a campus connection serves the purpose of addressing one of Montana Campus Compact's aims, which is to help higher education institutions get better involved with the communities they're located in. So today's example is regarding informational resources. The University of Chicago Consortium on School Research works to assess policy and practice in the Chicago school system. They then work to inform stakeholders such as policymakers, teachers, and families by publishing high-quality reports that are freely accessible to the public. Our takeaway from this can be that higher education institutions perform research that can be of value to community organizations. And so a few things to think about are whether any local colleges perform research in your region and publish those materials online, whether you can access scholarly databases at local college libraries or through any departmental partners you have, whether there are any faculty at a local college with interest in your project area. Are they willing to meet with you or recommend research you should review? All right, and that is all I have. So I can go ahead and hand things over to Pete. Okay, Pete, are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks for that. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Okay, let me see, first of all, some housekeeping, whether I can actually share my PowerPoint. Let's have a look, screen two. Bear with me, everybody. Okay, and then okay. All righty. Can everybody see that? Show of nods, heads, thumbs up. Wonderful. Just to confirm, you can just see one slide. You can't see any of the sort of note sections or anything like that, right? Great. Okay. Working in Zoom is always fun. So I appreciate your patience. So yeah, again, Maggie, thanks for the introduction there. My name is Pete Buchanan. I am the Associate Director here at Montana Campus Compact. And today, I was speaking today about stakeholder engagement. And it's a very large part of what I do within Montana Campus Compact. And for those of you who are not aware, Montana Campus Compact aims very much to promote stakeholder engagement. And for us, because our focus is on higher education and engaging college students, we work real closely with practitioners on the ground that are engaged in civic and community engagement. And then on top of that, we also work really closely with server sites and also with CEOs and presidents to make sure that, you know, when we're thinking about civic and community engagement, that the ideas and the strategies are not only sort of top down from CEOs, but they're also grassroots as well. So they come from bottom up. So anyway, that's that's kind of the overview for stakeholder engagement today. Okay, so who am I? Okay, so my name is Buchanan. We've kind of gone through that already. My pronouns are he, him. I focus mostly on operations, finance, award scholarships. But the bit that I get the most amount of joy from is actually our communities of practice work. And we have a few going on right now, whether that's ranging from our advisory committee, which is a group that is selected from each of our member campuses across Montana. And currently, I think we have 18 campuses that are part of that compact. And as a result, we have 18 advisory committee members that are part of that group. And the wonderful thing about the work that they do is that they are doing the work on the ground. They are working with students, they are working with service sites, and they really are the sort of they're really doing the projects that pull people together and begin to really facilitate that idea of civic and community engagement. So yeah, that's sort of my passion there. And then in case you're interested, my background is actually in psychology. I originally did psychology in Scotland. Really liked psychology, went on and got a master's, and I actually ended up specializing in evolutionary and comparative psychology, which is really about kind of looking at the origins of cognition and comparing that with other animals and stuff. So fun, but quite honestly, not as fun as trying to get people to engage in community practice work. So anyway, that is me. And I suppose the other thing I would say today is we're going to be using pretty heavy usage of the chat function. So please, I would encourage you to use that when appropriate. It's always wonderful to see that level of engagement that comes with the chat function. And use it. It's not just a sort of like we are giving you information. This is really intended to be not just sort of didactic, but it's supposed to be interactive, like this sort of flip classroom scenario. So please use that chat to talk to each other as well. And so just an overview of today, I'm going to be introducing stakeholders more generally, crucially how to identify stakeholders and how you can work with them. We'll then move into a small breakout, and that will give you an opportunity to review the information that we talked about today and apply it in a real world situation. Once you've identified your groups, crucially, you need to maintain that connection. And part of that is having effective stakeholder communication. So we'll touch on that a wee bit. And then finally, we'll wrap up. And if you have any other questions or anything you'd like answered, we've got a space to do that too. So yeah, as I said, in terms of like housekeeping, please hold most of your questions to the end. Have you got them sort of percolating up? With that said, if we do have situations where we're asking you to use the comments, please use the comments. It's always great to see, I say, that level of engagement. So with that said, let's move on to introducing stakeholders. And quite honestly, the work within civic and community engagement, these are the people that truly matter. So we need to work with some sort of framing. We need a definition to really kind of grab on and begin to build off. So what we tend to use is this community toolbox sort of product that we use very much as a reference piece. And so we pulled our definition from that. And in this case, stakeholders are those who may be affected by or have an effect. And they also might include people that have a strong interest in the effort for academic, philosophical, political reasons, even though and their families, friends, associates are not directly affected by it. So in many ways, I'm not sure that actually gets us any closer to deciding what a stakeholder is, but ultimately it's this idea of it's an entity, it's an individual, or it could even be a group of individuals that are either deciding directly to interact with, in this case, a community project, or they may be completely indirectly affected by it, but ultimately that might result in a positive or negative outcome. And so we need to be able to identify stakeholders. We really need to know who we're working with. And those are largely broken up into primary and secondary stakeholders. And the crucial difference actually goes back to the definition here. Primary stakeholders are people that are directly affected, either positively or negatively, by the effective actions of an agency, institution, or organization. And then conversely, secondary stakeholders are groups of people that are indirectly affected by positively or negatively by the effort or the actions of an agency. And so this is one of the sort of situations where we realize that we may well be stakeholders ourselves and not even be aware of it. And so for our first chat share exercise, please in the chat, we'll do this for just a minute or so, have a think about who are some stakeholders in your community work? Who do you interact with? That could be primary stakeholders, they could be secondary stakeholders. But have a think about that, because crucially, these individuals are the ones that you'll be working with. And ultimately, having them on side will help you to do to pull together the best project that you can do. Okay, so some of the messages in the chat here say LBGT community, excellent. That's a really good example. Community members more generally, yes, absolutely. That's definitely something that we generally don't need to consider. And again, like we kind of alluded to at the beginning, Lexi kind of points out this idea of students. Yes, they absolutely are stakeholders. And actually the work that we do in Montana Campus Compact, they very much are our key stakeholder, and we'll get onto key stakeholders shortly. Yeah, people who are housing burdened, public housing authority, business owners, unhoused populations, absolutely. Yeah, interesting, first responders, that's a good one. Founders of the organization, parents, refugees, teachers, faculty. Excellent. I mean, looking at these comments, I think you very much understand the concept of stakeholders and how they apply to the work you do. Wonderful. Okay, so as I kind of alluded to, we do have primary and secondary, but we also have key stakeholders. And there is often some confusion as to the real difference. In reality, key stakeholders can be primary, secondary, or they may not be anybody whatsoever but within that, in those two sort of categories. They may not actually necessarily fit in primary or secondary. But what they do is that they are considered by, in this case, either yourself or in this case, the organization, that they are very important to the work that you are currently trying to engage in. And in many ways, it's almost like a Venn diagram. If you have students, is probably the best example I saw in the chat there. If you take students, they can be primary stakeholders because you are working directly with them, and you may well be students yourselves in some degree. But you are working on campuses with those stakeholders. You're trying to develop a project that will ultimately impact either directly or indirectly the lives of those students. And so yeah, the students is a very good one. Yeah, and it's a good point to see in the chat. Not everybody are working on campuses, and we'll kind of get to that. It's the reason I allude to it is the work that we do at Montana Campus Compact. That's the primary driver. And ultimately, actually, because we work with students in campuses so much, campuses they're not isolated entities in their communities. They are connected to those communities. And actually the individuals, particularly on this call, for example, that may be doing AmeriCorps service sites that are not directly related to a campus is a really good example of those connections that are made campuses and off campuses. And so, you know, they're not disconnected and they very much interact with each other. So it's a really good point. Yeah, all of you are not going to be working on campuses, but the work that you do is, you know, equally as important. And so if we think about, again, we kind of go back to Montana Campus Compact as sort of our base. Montana Campus Compact's primary stakeholders are students. And some of you might be surprised to learn, and maybe not, that actually, while we do mainly focus on college students and college attainment and retention, etc., high school students are also primary stakeholders as well. And that's partly because of the awards and scholarship systems that we have in place to try and support high schoolers to come through into higher education and remove some of those barriers. Importantly, faculty are primary stakeholders. Some of the work that we do is very much focused on service learning, which in all honesty is a presentation in and of itself, but it's really about integrating service and civics engagement into some sort of curriculum and making sure that the course that they're doing really embeds civic and community engagement in the work that they do. So having faculty on board is incredibly important, and arguably within higher education, it's very much the thread that kind of pulls everything together. As I talked to you before, advisory committee members are primary stakeholders as well. They're very much our sort of boots on the ground, grassroots, and then AmeriCorps project sides. Secondary stakeholders does tend to get a bit more broad because there's so much overlap between the primary and secondary. But AmeriCorps members are secondary stakeholders, the staff, families of the beneficiaries. Example of that would be high school, the parents of high school students. And yeah, any of the staff at service sites receiving AmeriCorps support. And then crucially, and again, this is why we keep going back to Montana Campus Compact as our base, how we define and consider our key stakeholders is very much based upon our mission and how we go about doing that sort of strategically. And so we consider our key stakeholders to actually be college presidents and CEOs. And again, part of the job that I support is actually helping the CEO Council in collaboration with the Executive Director, Josh Vanek, who you'll be seeing, I believe, next week. And so being able to understand the needs of the colleges from the CEOs and the Chancellor's perspective is really important, because you need to make sure you're trying to align what they want, how they intend to achieve it, and making sure you're embedding the work that you do into what they do too. So therefore it kind of trickles down through the institution. Grant makers is a really important one. You need to get on side with your grant makers. The way in which Montana Campus Compact is largely structured is that we function on state and federal grants. And so the relationship we have with the Corporation for National and Community Service, which is referred to as CNCS, is incredibly important. And ultimately, if we don't have those revenue streams to come in and support the work we do, the rest of it is kind of not sustainable. So we spend an awful lot of time kind of developing and fostering that relationship. And then finally, we need some sort of oversight in what we do and making sure that we're, you know, we apply for funds, and, you know, we've got to step up to the plate and do what we're, you know, say what we're going to do and ultimately do it and follow through. So part of the governor's office is to provide oversight and ensure that we're kind of meeting our sort of compliance standards. So those are our key stakeholders. And again, there could very well be overlap between these. And I would argue that I reckon students could probably be slotted into key stakeholders there as well, because ultimately all of this framework that we're developing is to ultimately impact positively, and from our perspective, hopefully, students in higher education. So while we have these fairly straightforward categories, I think it is important to understand that there are different ways of thinking about stakeholders and how you can go about strategically approaching them. And so one of the ways to do that is using a stakeholder power interest matrix. And the matrix itself is split up into 4 quadrants. So you've got keep satisfied, encourage and influence, monitor, and keep informed. And on the X and Y axis, you've got power, and you've got interest. And the idea is that you would take your key stakeholders, and in fact, you could probably, sorry, in all honesty, you should probably do this with all your stakeholders to really get a handle on how much time, effort, and bandwidth you have to develop these relationships, and to, you know, and to understand that, you know, those relationships do take time to develop. Trust takes time to develop, but crucially, you need to prioritize where you're going to spend your time. And using the matrix is a really interesting way of doing that. So what we're going to do for our small group breakout is we are going to do a thought exercise. So we're going to place you in you are the principal of a high school in New York City. And you have a couple of questions to answer here. So we've got 10 minutes to think about the following. Who are your primary, secondary, and key stakeholders? And where do they belong in the stakeholder power interest matrix? And crucially, why? Once you're in your groups, justify or attempt to justify the reasons for your selection. And yeah, there's a good point there in the chat. We should be able to go back and just kind of keep that on the screen, Maggie. Would that work? Are we able to do that?
Yeah, I can also send it out via email at the end of the session, if that would work as well.
Okay, well, maybe we can do both, and then that way we're kind of making sure we're addressing everybody's needs. Okay, so with that said, Maggie, are you okay splitting people up into groups?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that now.
Wonderful. All right, everybody, I will see you back in 10 minutes.
Almeida and Ray, did you get a notification to join a breakout room?
There we go.
I wanted to ask you about the newsletter. So I'm putting together a Google Doc currently that has basically all the information that I'm pulling from the website with like required forms and everything. What were you thinking for desired length?
You know, that's a real good question. I personally prefer concise content over just information dumping. And the reason I say that is, like, you know, you get a newsletter pushed through to your email inbox, and like the ones that really stand out to me are the ones that are honestly not sparse, but like they're not just like a sea of words, and it's very sort of picture sort of driven. So that maybe doesn't answer your question, but I would say I wouldn't do more than something like maybe 500 words, maybe. Yeah, maybe 500. I think 250 might be a little bit light, maybe not quite enough. Yeah, aim for 500 and see whether you can kind of you can share all the information that you and Kate want to share in that newsletter piece, and see where that ends up. And again, if that's just not enough, then yeah, we can work with that. I think ultimately we need something that's like strong, that really you know, that really reflects the message that you guys are trying to sort of push out there. But it's not, because really what we want is we do want this sort of newsletter, but we actually want to be able to push it and therefore click through. We want people to click through to the website to do all the rest of it. This piece is really just a you know, almost like window dressing to make sure that folks are just like, oh yeah, it's on my radar. I want to, you know, keep going with that. So that's my answer, is that I try it at 500 and see how that goes. And
yeah, I mean, I think I have less than that now. Basically what it is defining what each program involves, like be it direct service or indirect, and then I don't like I could list the documents that they have to review and sign, but I don't know.
I don't know. I feel like that might be a bit much. I mean, you really
Yeah.
want it to be like, you want it to be positive, you want it to be interesting, you want it to be sort of like, oh yeah, that does align with what I do and how I do it. And, you know, so I wouldn't put too much in there. And like I say, I would, in most cases, anything that involves like multiple like documents to review, you want to host those on a website and just be like, go to this page if you really are interested in digging into the, you know, into the weeds of it.
Yeah, I was thinking about maybe linking the project proposal form so people can see what it involves, and then including a link to the website page, which has a lot more information,
Yeah,
as
I
well
would do that.
as Callie and Adriana's emails.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of doing it. Yeah.
Okay.
I always think there's to have. I always think it's a really good idea to very clearly define the difference between AmeriCorps and Vista, because honestly, if we can't do that, then we're failing everybody, because ultimately they need to know what's appropriate for their sites. And it's amazing how many times we're like, well, we don't really know the difference. It's like, well, no, there is a clear difference, but sometimes it's not very clearly communicated. And so I think that should really be the sort of spirit that drives it, is like, you know, what's the difference? Why is it important? How does it benefit you?
Okay, that sounds good.
So because I've got the stakeholders matrix up here, are they able to see that? Or is that...
I don't think so. I think once you go into the breakout room, you can't see it any longer. But I mean, I have everybody's email, so I can just send it out
Okay.
after the session. And just pull it from the slide. And then I was looking through, does the last slide of this presentation have Eli's contact information on it in a way that's like impossible to delete?
I found a way. Yeah, he
Okay.
basically embedded it into the actual friggin'
Yeah, I
wallpaper.
think
I
he
was
made it
like,
the background.
dude,
Yeah.
yeah. So I have updated it. It'll be a surprise when we get to that page. I've
Okay.
updated it with
Thank
your
you.
contact information, Maggie.
Yeah.
I was trolling it, being like, oh geez, oh Eli, you do not want to be forgotten, do you?
Well, I think it's because he was sending it out to all the different presenters and everything. So I guess he didn't want it to be stolen, but you can delete the slides so easily. I didn't notice it until I was going through this today, and I was like, oh man, they all have it. But I guess Callie just deleted hers, so I'm hoping I'll contact Morgan and Kim and see, because they're the only ones who aren't part of the office who are doing it.
I mean, don't get me wrong, mine was pretty it was pretty janky the way I did it, but it's fine. It looks fine. I mean, for what it is. But I was like, well, I was like, no, this is you're the Vista coordinator. You know, you're the coordinator or specialist. I always forget, Maggie. Are you
I'm
specialist?
coordinator of CBI, but I'm the Vista program specialist.
Okay, I had you down in, because I wasn't too sure. I had you down as the AmeriCorps Vista specialist. That's what it says on the slide, which is not untrue, but maybe not context appropriate. But I put your contact details down anyway.
Awesome. Well, thank you for catching that. I
No,
guess
that's all
I
right.
didn't go through them carefully enough.
The one that got me, I literally changed it about 2 minutes before we got onto it, was actually the very first slide that was just like presenter's name. And I was like, that's probably quite a good one to catch. But I went through most of it. I was just made sure that it's not, I don't know. I mean, I've definitely tried to make it flow a bit more as well, and just make sure that but for the most part, I honestly just think Eli's done such a good job with this that.
Yeah, I can imagine if all of this wasn't set up, I think I'd be freaking out right now. Actually, this still wouldn't be happening for another couple months, because I feel like this wouldn't have been possible if all the slides weren't already made and like all the guides and suggested readings and stuff. So
I mean, it's a curriculum. Like you have to. I
Mhm.
mean, I can't remember when we actually really did this to begin with. I want to say it's 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Callie did it like her first year.
Oh, did she? Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay, so that's 6 years ago then, right?
Yeah, and so she's the one who set up the Eventbrite account,
Yeah.
which was like her contribution to it. Um, but I guess she was in a meeting with Josh and whoever the program director was at the time, and they asked like how many participants she had, and she was like, "Oh, I have 19." And there was a freak out because apparently that wasn't like what they were expecting. Um, so, but
Um,
yeah, I mean, I think we've made over $1,000 on Eventbrite so far, and obviously some of that will go towards the honorariums, but that's only $400 out of it, so
it's not bad. That's
not
not bad.
bad.
It's not bad. I mean, there is an argument to be made for like, do we actually want to like lean into that type of revenue a bit more? Like, do we host more of these things? And I mean, my argument would be yes. I mean,
Mhm.
this is not that. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is a lot of work to make it an actual curriculum accredited thing. That's a lot of work, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to go to that level. Like, it doesn't need to be that intense. But I do think we need to lean into like, what are our strengths? Where do we, how can we, you know, we are very much that conduit. And the reason we're the conduit is because it's quite challenging to get higher ed institutions to frigging talk to each other. Like they just do their own thing. So you need someone to generate the energy to keep it going. And I think we're very well placed. But it is funny, like even in Billings, working with the colleges here, I'm like trying to get them to talk and stuff, and they're just like, mm. So
Yep. No,
anyway,
I guess
I see the value in us as an institution. So.
yeah, I guess when I was planning this, the main issue was like I didn't really have enough social capital to like ask people to present at that point. So I'm thinking next year it'll be a little bit easier as I know people.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just this. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If I was you, I'd be pulling pretty heavily from our, from staff because they know this work and you know, that's what, and I think you did, you very much did that. And I quite like how you've also got your external presenters as well. So yeah, it's I think if I'm honest, I think it's worked out really well. And I think this has been really smooth so far. And yeah, it's all worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you are welcome. All righty. Well, people are starting to cycle back in there. Got some rooms here that are like refuse. They clearly got some engaging conversation going on. So good for them. Okay, good. Nearly there. Room 6 is clearly man, they're keen. Oh, here they are. Excellent. Here we wait on Samantha, Jesse, Lorraine, Elsa. Oh, great name, Elsa. I love it. Oh, still waiting on a couple more. Alrighty, well, I think that is everybody back. Hopefully you got a chance to kind of think about the matrix and how that would apply to the work that you do. And again, it's intended as a guide. This is really not, it's supposed to be like, this is not supposed to be prescriptive. This is a tool for you to use to really begin to think strategically about the stakeholders that you engage with, in your service period. And so, as we kind of alluded to before, once you have identified your stakeholders, your primary, your secondary, and then crucially your key stakeholders, you need to be able to maintain that communication. You need to be able to maintain the energy and really kind of push that forward. And you'd be surprised how often how little time is put aside for thinking about communication because it's almost an assumed strategy that's gonna take place. But typically it doesn't happen. And what ends up typically happening is while you have identified your key stakeholders, you're like, well, what do I do with them now? Like, how do I create a strategy to consistently and develop high impact relationships with these individuals, crucially, so you can, you know, maximize the impact you can have in your local communities. And so we go to the idea of like the ways to communicate. And some of you may well be really familiar with this. You know, you may understand like, well, of course, this is how you would interact with these agencies. But there are some ways that I think some folks are almost a bit reluctant to engage with. So one of the ones I wanted to bring your attention to is the idea of a press release. I think a lot of folks have seen that as can be quite intimidating, because typically they come from, you know, state, national, federal, could be quite large businesses. But actually issuing a press release, particularly if you're, you know, particularly if you're working in higher education, they're quite easy to push through. But that doesn't mean to say that if you're working at a nonprofit level, yeah, there's no reason why you can't do that as well. And I would I would highly encourage you, if you haven't done a quick Google tool already for how to do a press release, ChatGPT is your best friend in all of these types of approaches, because it will give you so many ideas about ways to design and approach communication. And so press releases is one way. It certainly helps if you have an institution to support the work that you do, and crucially can help you find contacts to continue pushing that out through your networks. I'm sure most of you have either engaged with or refused to engage with social media. You know, it's a tool, and some people really like it, and other folks, you know, actively choose to stay away from it. But ultimately, if you're using it in a way that is productive and healthy, then social media can be an avenue. Email newsletters. Yep, that is definitely an approach we certainly take. It's not our primary approach, I think, when we're coming to communicating with stakeholders, but it's certainly a way that we try and disseminate information as quickly as possible. And, you know, honestly, just keep people engaged with the work that they do, so they don't feel isolated and begin to generate networks of their own as well. Annual reports is a really interesting one. Typically, you are required to produce an annual report, especially if you have shareholders. They want to know what you've done. Nonprofits often have boards rather than shareholders, typically. And as a result, annual reports are a really good way of communicating the work that you are doing, either internally or, as we often do, externally as well. Like we at Montana Campus Compact, we have this idea of, you know, we've got a fairly good idea about how our sections work within the department. But crucially, we need to be able to communicate that to all of our nonprofit stakeholders that we have as well. So, and yeah, I'm just looking at the chat here, create forms of communication, business cards, QR codes. That's an excellent one. Definitely a more modern version of making sure that you're removing those barriers to communication so that people can find, you know, find the information they need. Word of mouth is real strong. I think that's one of those ones where people just think it's a legacy piece. But honestly, often it's actually the main reason why a lot of people will even be attracted to a particular nonprofit or a service site, because they understand that the weight of someone saying, look, this is really worth your time. Like, they're doing some fantastic work here. And that can go a long way. So don't disregard word of mouth. Posters and flyers, kind of the physical media stuff. Ads, that can be physical, but it can also be typically digital. Websites is a big one. You want to be able to host stuff on a website. You don't necessarily want to update it as much as maybe social media. Brochures is a great way if you are doing a lot of travel, I would say, if you're going out to different service sites to share the work that you're doing. Mailings becoming less important these days, but still a valid form of communication. Public demonstrations, that's a really good one if you're doing non-profit sweat equity work would be a good idea. So if you're doing some sort of boots on the ground type service project, doing a public demonstration in an environment where people are going to be like, they wouldn't have necessarily considered doing that type of service, but seeing people do it and having some sort of interactive piece can really be a big draw. You know, our AmeriCorps members love their swag. They love their t-shirts and their water bottles and hats. And a good example of that would be tabling. Giving out swag is always a way to attract people. And then, yeah, anything creative that makes people curious, that is typically the way you want to try and set up your communication strategy. Now, people have already, I really appreciate you folks putting some comments in the chat there already. For those of you that haven't, I'm just going to move my wee Zoom bar here. What creative forms of communication have you seen already? So just spend a minute and just think about what other ways can you communicate with each other. Music, interesting. I like that one. I do like that one. Great. Sponsorship, wonderful. Yeah, Shannon. Non-visual communication, yeah. Podcast and radio, wonderful. Really like that one too. Gary, yeah. Hosting community events. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, well, billboards, bus stops, quickly shout outs to team members do something incredible for the organization. Yeah, absolutely. So Ethan, that's a really good example. One of the things that we certainly advocate for is making sure that we celebrate the work of not only, I mean, we want to be able to celebrate our staff. Like, good example would be Maggie. Maggie has pulled together the, CBI this year, and has really done a phenomenal job with it. So we would want to celebrate Maggie for doing that. That's sort of the internal piece. But, we also want to make sure that there are volunteers in campus communities and non-campus communities. There are, we really want to be able to celebrate the work that we do. And part of our strategy is making sure that we have a fairly robust awards and scholarship program to do that too. So excellent. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so one of the key things you need to do is once you have this idea of like, well, we know who our key stakeholders are, crucially, we've got some ideas about how we might want to engage them. We need to create a communication plan. And again, this doesn't need to be prescriptive. This can really just be a thought exercise. But crucially, you need to, number one, you need to understand your purpose. You need to understand the goal. Like, why are you actually doing this? Like, what is the intended outcome? You need to identify your audience. If you are working on a service site that is directly impacting, say, high school students, communicating with college students is maybe not going to be your best approach. Where you really want to be getting the most leverage, or where you're going to get the most return, is making sure that you're actually focusing on the high school students themselves, potentially the parents, administrators in those schools. Those are the areas you really want to be tapping. On top of that, because let's just say that in this case, the high school students that you want to identify and promote are working to get into college, that sort of transition piece. You might also want to identify audience such as you might want to look at TRIO, student support services might be another one to think about. So making sure you're very clear on who you're targeting is very, very important, because your time is probably the most important commodity at this stage, and you need to be able to pretty much be surgical about who you're going to be tapping there. You need to be able to choose your message as well. It needs to be positive for the most part. I mean, don't get me wrong, the work that a lot of folks are going to be doing may not actually be positive. It might be a lot of, there might be an awful lot of challenge identifying, gaps in service, and you're kind of going in there to either build the infrastructure to support these people, or you're literally doing the sort of the boots on the ground stuff. And so, but you do need to frame it in a way that people are going to be interested. And just it kind of goes this idea about mood. You want to be talking about positive things, you want to be talking about success, and ultimately, why you're doing the work you're doing, and how the people you're trying to communicate with can have a positive impact in that area, and that unaddressed need that you're trying to deal with. And then crucially, you want to choose your channels. It's kind of similar to identifying your audience in this one, because you need to understand where your audience is going to be consuming that media. And that goes back to the idea of like whether that's going to be newsletters, whether that's going to be social media. I do love one of the comments in the suggestions in the comments here with the idea of podcast and radio. That's a great one. And again, I love the idea of sort of business cards and QR codes as well. So you need to be thinking about your channels, and ultimately, how how high impact they are going to be. Is it worth your time to do that? And so it's also worth just thinking about your messaging. And while we can get into the weeds about this a wee bit, and I think some of the work that we're talking about here, being inclusive, being accessible, and crucially being equitable, this is kind of tip of the spear stuff right now. So don't get me wrong, there's an awful lot of people that want to be doing an awful lot of positive work in this field. I would say you really just need to be thinking critically and about the messaging you want to use, the wording you want to, the phrasing you want to apply. And crucially, digesting this, the take-home message is it's about tone and it's about approach. If you can basically identify the approach you're going to take, and you're going to do it in a successful way that is inclusive, accessible, and equitable, you're going to do okay. Don't get too tied up in what you can't say, really focusing on your messaging, but just be mindful that there's an awful lot of colloquialisms that we use in everyday language that actually might be rooted in, and I think the advice, one of the examples here is the idea of grandfathered in. That's actually has its origins in suppression of Black voters, and so just be careful about what you're saying. But ultimately, it's about what message you're sending. And are you creating safe spaces to be able to do the work that you do? And so ultimately, you need to remind people, why you matter in this, and don't let staff and volunteers or donors forget that. They need to be reminded what the message is, what has been accomplished, and crucially, what is going to be accomplished, and how they can slot in to the work that you're doing, which then leads nicely into the idea of reminding people why they matter in the work that you do. And again, don't let the staff and the volunteers forget that. I've put the word impactful in italics because I'm not entirely sure it's a real word, but I would say, you need to be able to see the impact that their time and money has actually had, and how much their efforts mean to those stakeholders that are directly benefiting. And so I want to give you a real world example by putting kind of theory into practice here. And so the example I want to share today is a fairly recent one. So this is Montana Campus Compact's Montana Athletes in Service Award. And the point of the award itself is to celebrate student athletes that volunteer in their communities. And the reason we kind of focus on this is because it's our idea of ultimately students are one of our key stakeholders. But we also we're thinking critically about, well, wait a minute, it's the student body is not some homogeneous entity. It has very discrete communities within it. And one of the things we identified was this idea of student athletes, not only do they typically engage quite a lot in volunteerism anyway, some of them have it as a component of their scholarship. And so as a result, we're like, well, this is kind of, ticking several boxes. Not only are we making sure that, we're celebrating the work that they're already doing, but we're also saying, look, the work that you do does deserve to be honored. It's not just a tick box in your scholarship, but it's to them to understand why it's a requirement of their scholarship. So that's where the Athletes in Service sort of piece came about. And so we used a similar sort of thing when we think about a communication strategy. We identify the purpose. So as I shared, we kind of celebrate student athletes and the volunteer contributions in their local community. The audience that we typically tap are going to be students, faculty, athletics, campus communities, and that goes back to this idea of, student populations are not homogenous. There is an enormous amount of variation there, not only within just your average campus community, which in itself doesn't really mean much. Most campus communities are pretty diverse anyway. But it's about making sure that we're also, celebrating, or rather acknowledging the nominators in that. And the reason that nominators are important in the Athletes in Service Award is because athletics directors typically are the ones that will nominate an individual. but we also want to make sure that those family members are being sort of we're sharing that sort of message with them too. And so the message we want to be pretty clear about is that we want to acknowledge and we want to honor civic and community engagement on Montana campuses. And like, while we do specialize, we focus rather on students, athletics, individuals, and within Montana, but that doesn't mean we think exclusively in those terms. We actually want to be able to do that much more broadly, not just within the state, but also at the sort of, like, if you like, I want to say federal level, but just at the sort of like country level, we want to be able to promote that too. It just so happens that's where we focus in order to make sure that we're kind of maximizing resource and just getting the best we can for it. And then the channels that we typically go through to do that are athletics officers, campus marketing and communications officers, who I will tell you now are your best friends. Make sure you make sure you reach out to them. They really want this stuff. They really want to be able to promote their colleges and the work that they do to the students. It helps with brochures. It helps with even just kind of promoting and generating interest in scholarships and whatnot. You can expand that a bit further and look at local press offices as well. Look for newspapers. Look for digital platforms that focus on where you are. And they really want this stuff. And then as I said before, kind of social, and there's also physical media too. So you need to make a decision. You need to critically think about, what is your purpose? Who is your audience? What's the message that you really want to push out there that really represents the organization you're working for? And then you need to think about the channels that you're going to be tapping to make sure that that takes place. And so I also wanted to share a example of how we went about doing that. And so I just pulled a couple here. And the ones that really work for us is that press release. They get picked up. They really do. The local news agencies are the ones that absolutely love the immediate release for press releases. So do not be afraid to think about generating a press release. They do get picked up, and it's wonderful to see the interest at the local level. And the reason I'm kind of thinking about this a bit more is that there are certain places, certainly where around, I'm actually based in Billings right now, even though Montana Campus Compact is actually based in Missoula. And there's some towns around Billings that their papers just absolutely love to hear about the work that their students are doing. And so it's always a pleasure to be able to push those things out as much as possible. And just a shout out to Montana State University Billings. They typically do the same thing. They love hearing about this type of work that's being done. So anyway, so that's the press release. That's one thing that we typically use. We also are big advocates for using our newsletters. So there's a screenshot here from our featured news. And we send that out to, again, our key stakeholders, so they're aware and they can share that. And then we also use social media too. And so you'll notice that each of these types of media are ever so slightly different. The formats are different, but crucially, they are communicating the same event and the same message. And so before we kind of part ways, I really wanted to just instill the key takeaways from today. So crucially, stakeholders are anyone who impacts or is impacted by your efforts. And we hope that they are positive efforts in that you're addressing an unmet need in a community. Different stakeholders should be engaged in different ways. And that kind of just goes back to the previous slide about how we think about how different groups of people like to engage and communicate with that types of media. And then crucially, strong communication keeps everyone engaged and on the same page. And that goes back to this idea of, like, do you have a communication plan? Who is your audience? What is your message? And how are you going to go about doing it? And so that's pretty much it. That's all I've got. So thank you for attending today. I really do appreciate it. As I said, my name is Buchanan. I'm the Associate Director here at Montana Campus Compact. If you do have any messages, if you would like to reach out and have a chat, please do. I'm available. And I think that's pretty much it. That's all I've got to share today. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all the sort of interaction we've had in the chat today. You guys have been wonderful. It's been really nice to see kind of getting you thinking about this. And yeah, like I say, I am doing one presentation today, but I am still here. And if you have any broader questions, please reach out and do so. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time. I'll hand it back over to Maggie to close us out.
Great, thank you, Pete. That was really great. All right, so just for everybody's information, our next CBI session will be held at the same Zoom link at the same time this Friday, and then continue next week. Thank you all for coming to the second session. I really appreciate your participation. And if there are no questions, then we are all set for today. Oh, and your second reflection will be going out in about 7 minutes. So if you don't receive that, please shoot me an email. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Have a good one. See you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.